So let me read you guys the new Coast Guard statement that came out, and this is sort of the latest from the Coast Guard. And you can kind of read between the lines some of what they're saying here. And they're obviously being careful what they say too, because this is such an active investigation. We know because we saw them going on and off the boat in Fort Pierce at the Coast Guard station.
On April 4th, 2024, a woman vanished in the dark waters off the coast of the Bahamas. Her husband claims she fell from their small inflatable boat during rough weather. He says the winds and currents pulled them apart as he desperately tried to reach her. He says it was a tragic accident that took the love of his life. But 2 years before Lynette Hooker disappeared, her husband made a chilling threat. He told her exactly how he would kill her. He said he would make sure her body would never be found. He said he would throw her overboard into the ocean. And now, more than a month after Lynette vanished, federal investigators have launched a full criminal investigation. The United States Coast Guard seized her husband's sailboat 40 miles off the Florida coast. Crime scene tape now surrounds the vessel. Special agents have been photographed going on and off the boat, removing evidence, processing what authorities are now calling an active crime scene. Lynette's daughter knew something was wrong the moment she heard about her mother's disappearance. She didn't believe the story for a single second. And as details continue to emerge, more and more people are asking the same question. What really happened to Lynette Hooker on that April night in the Bahamas? Before we dive deeper into this case, if you're interested in true crime investigations and want to stay updated on stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications for True Crime Desk. We're going to break down everything we know about this disturbing case, and your support helps us continue bringing you these important stories. Lynette Hooker had a dream. For as long as her daughter Carly could remember, Lynette talked about living on a sailboat and exploring the world. It wasn't just idle conversation or a fantasy she mentioned once or twice. This was something Lynette genuinely wanted, something she worked toward, something that represented freedom and adventure to her. And eventually, that dream came true. Lynette and her husband Brian Hooker purchased a sailboat. They named it Soulmate. The couple from Michigan left their life on land behind and became full-time liveaboards, sailing through the Caribbean and the Bahamas. For Lynette, this was everything she had hoped for. The boat took them to places many people only see in photographs. They visited New Orleans. They spent time in Key West. They explored the crystal-clear waters of the Bahamas, moving from island to island, experiencing the kind of life that Lynette had always envisioned. Carly would fly out to meet her mother in different locations. She remembers visiting them in New Orleans, in Key West, and in the Bahamas. She would spend several days with her mom and Brian, experiencing a glimpse of their sailing lifestyle. Carly describes these visits as pretty cool, getting to see new locations with her mother, exploring places she might not have visited otherwise. The sailboat life had its appeal, at least from the outside. But there was something Lynette wanted that she never got. Despite living full-time on the Soulmate, Lynette talked about buying a house. She wanted a home base, something solid and permanent on land, a place she could return to, a piece of stability in an otherwise transient lifestyle. For reasons that would later seem significant, Lynette never got that house. She never established that home base. She remained on the sailboat with Brian, moving from port to port, island to island, with no permanent address on land. Carly maintained a close relationship with her mother despite the distance and the unconventional lifestyle. They would text regularly. When Carly needed advice, she would reach out to Lynette. The last time Carly spoke with her mother was on a Friday. It was the Friday before Lynette disappeared. The conversation was normal, ordinary, the kind of exchange they had countless times before. Carly was asking her mother for advice about something in her own life. Lynette helped her daughter work through it. Nothing about that conversation stood out as unusual or alarming. Nothing suggested that within days, Lynette would be gone. But there was something Carly didn't know during that final conversation. There were things her mother never told her, relationship problems that Lynette kept to herself. Carly has said that her mother didn't really confide in her about issues with Brian. When Carly and Lynette talked, it was usually Carly bringing up things she wanted advice about. Lynette listened, offered guidance, played the role of mother and supporter. But she didn't share the difficulties in her own relationship. She protected her daughter from those details, kept those struggles private. Looking at photographs of Lynette, there's something immediately noticeable about her smile. People who never met her have commented on it. There's a warmth there, an approachability that comes through even in still images. She looks like someone you would want to talk to, someone who would listen and care about what you had to say. That quality wasn't just visible in photos. It was part of who Lynette was, the kind of person who put others at ease, who made people feel valued and heard. And now that person was gone, vanished into the ocean under circumstances that didn't make sense to anyone who knew her or knew the man she was with that night. Brian Hooker is a man with two distinct sides. That's how people who know him describe it, not as nuance or complexity, but as two different versions of the same person. There's the Brian Hooker who can be charming and outgoing, someone who knows how to talk to people and make a good impression. This is the public-facing Brian, the one strangers and acquaintances would meet and find pleasant enough. But then there's the other side. When Brian gets irritated, when things don't go the way he wants them to, the charm disappears. People close to the situation have described him as becoming smartassy, difficult, and worse. Carly has used even blunter language to describe her stepfather when his mood shifts. This duality is something she witnessed firsthand during her visits to see her mother on the sailboat. Most of the time, Brian would be fine, sociable, the version of himself he wanted others to see. But when irritation crept in, when frustration surfaced, a different person emerged. The relationship between Brian and Lynette had serious problems that went far beyond normal marital disagreements or the stress of living in close quarters on a boat. 2 years before Lynette disappeared, something happened that should have ended the relationship permanently. In 2024, Brian and Lynette had a fight. During that fight, Brian allegedly choked Lynette. He wrapped his hands around her neck and cut off her air supply, one of the most dangerous forms of domestic violence, an act that significantly increases the likelihood of future lethal violence. But Brian didn't stop with physical assault. He made a threat, and it was specific. He told Lynette that he would kill her. He told her he would throw her overboard. He told her he would make sure nobody could find her body. These weren't vague statements made in the heat of anger. This was a detailed explanation of how he would murder her and dispose of her remains in a way that would prevent discovery, prevent justice, prevent anyone from knowing what he had done. Lynette's response to this violence and these threats was immediate. She left. She got away from Brian after that fight, separated herself from the man who had just described exactly how he would kill her. For a period of time, Lynette was free from Brian Hooker. She had escaped. But domestic violence relationships are complicated. Survivors often return to their abusers multiple times before achieving permanent separation. The reasons are complex, involving psychological manipulation, financial dependence, isolation from support systems, and trauma bonding. Whatever the reasons in Lynette's specific case, she went back to Brian a couple of months after leaving him. She returned to the man who had choked her and threatened to throw her overboard so nobody could find her. She returned to the sailboat, to the isolated life on the water, to a relationship that her daughter says continued to involve fighting. Carly has indicated that the fighting between her mother and Brian persisted after they reconciled. The problems didn't go away. The relationship didn't heal. Whatever led to that violent incident in 2024 remained unresolved. Lynette was back on the soulmate with a man who had already shown her who he was and what he was capable of doing. And she still hadn't purchased that house she wanted, still hadn't established a home base on land, still had no permanent place of her own to escape to if things became dangerous again. 2 years after Brian Hooker allegedly choked Lynette and told her exactly how he would kill her, Lynette Hooker disappeared in the ocean under circumstances that matched Brian's threat almost perfectly. April 4th, 2024. That's the date Brian Hooker says his wife vanished from their small inflatable dinghy in the waters off the Bahamas. According to Brian's account, the couple left shore at Hopetown in Abaco around 7:30 in the evening. They were in their dinghy, a small inflatable boat used to travel between the shore and their sailboat when the sailboat was anchored offshore. Brian claims the weather was rough that night. He describes unpredictable seas and high winds. He says these conditions caused Lynette to fall from the dinghy near an area called Elbow Cay. Brian says he made desperate attempts to reach his wife after she went into the water. He says the winds and currents drove them further and further apart. He describes being unable to get to her despite his efforts. He claims he was powerless to save her as she drifted away in the darkness. But here's where the timeline becomes important. Brian says Lynette fell from the dinghy around 7:30 in the evening. He says he didn't reach shore until 4 o'clock the next morning. That's an 8.5-hour gap between when Lynette allegedly went into the water and when Brian arrived at Marsh Harbor to report what happened. 8.5 hours. What was Brian doing during that time? He was supposedly alone in a dinghy, having lost his wife to the ocean. Why did it take 8.5 hours to reach shore and get help? These are questions that people began asking immediately, questions that Brian has never adequately answered. When Brian finally reached shore at 4 in the morning, search and rescue personnel responded. They took Brian out to search for Lynette. By all accounts, this search lasted approximately 3 to 4 hours. Then search and rescue brought Brian back to his sailboat, the Soulmate. And this is where Brian's behavior becomes even more difficult to understand. After search and rescue brought him back to his boat, Brian stayed on the Soulmate. He didn't continue searching for his wife. He didn't demand that efforts to find Lynette continue. He didn't provide additional information or details that might help locate her. He simply stayed on his sailboat. For nearly 24 hours, Brian Hooker remained on the Soulmate while his wife was missing in the ocean. Search and rescue eventually brought his dinghy back to him, the same dinghy Lynette had allegedly fallen from. And still, Brian didn't resume searching. He sat on his boat. A man named Blaine Stevenson, who describes himself as a friend of Brian Hooker, spoke to media about this timeline. Stevenson laid out the facts in a way that highlighted just how strange Brian's behavior was. The incident allegedly happened Saturday evening at 7:30. Brian came ashore at 4 in the morning. Search and rescue took him out for 3 or 4 hours and brought him back to his boat. Then Brian sat on his boat for almost 24 hours until search and rescue brought him his dinghy back. Stevenson asked the questions many people were thinking. Even if Brian accepts the fact that his wife is gone, doesn't he want closure? Doesn't he want answers? Why wasn't he demanding more information? Why wasn't he out there searching himself? At no point did Brian really look at the situation and provide anybody with more details than he had at the beginning when he was supposedly in shock. The lack of urgency was striking to people in the area. Local Bahamians who heard about the incident said Brian's story didn't add up. They know those waters. They understand the conditions. They recognize when something doesn't make sense. And nothing about Brian's account made sense to them. Lynette's family had the same reaction. From the moment they heard what Brian was claiming, they didn't believe it. The story had too many holes, too many inconsistencies, too many elements that contradicted what they knew about their daughter, their sister, their mother. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment saying, "Justice for Lynette," and let me know what you think about this case so far. The story gets even more disturbing from here, and I want to hear your thoughts. And if you haven't already, please hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Desk so you don't miss part 2 of this investigation. While questions swirled and suspicions grew, Brian Hooker took to Facebook to tell his version of events. He posted a statement that he clearly wanted to be seen as the words of a grieving husband, a man devastated by the loss of his beloved wife. The post read like this. Brian wrote that he was heartbroken over the recent boat accident in unpredictable seas and high winds that caused his beloved Lynette to fall from their small dinghy near Elbow Cay in the Bahamas. He wrote that despite desperate attempts to reach her, the winds and currents drove them further apart. Then Brian wrote something that would later seem particularly significant. He stated that we continue to search for her and that this is my sole focus. We continue to search for her. That is my sole focus. Those were Brian Hooker's words on Facebook. But those words didn't match the reality of what Brian was actually doing. According to Blaine Stevenson and others who were in the area, Brian searched for a few hours with search and rescue, then spent 24 hours on his sailboat doing nothing. That doesn't sound like someone whose sole focus is continuing to search. The statement about continuing to search seemed designed to create an impression that wasn't true, to make people believe Brian was desperately trying to find his wife when the evidence suggested otherwise. Brian also made another statement during this time. He said he would never leave the Bahamas until he found Lynette. Never. He presented himself as a man who would stay in that location, searching and waiting and hoping for any sign of his missing wife, for as long as it took. He wanted people to believe he was committed to finding Lynette, that he wouldn't give up, that he wouldn't abandon the search. But that statement, like his claim about continuing to search, turned out to be false. Brian didn't stay in the Bahamas. He left, and he left pretty quickly. Before Brian could leave, However, Bahamian authorities had questions. A lot of questions. They took Brian Hooker into custody. This wasn't a brief interview at a police station where he was free to leave whenever he wanted. The Bahamian authorities arrested Brian and held him in jail. For 5 days, Brian Hooker sat in a Bahamian jail cell while investigators questioned him about his wife's disappearance. 5 days is a significant amount of time to hold someone without charging them. It suggests authorities had serious suspicions, but perhaps not quite enough evidence to file charges. They kept him as long as they legally could, trying to build a case, trying to get answers, trying to understand what really happened to Lynette Hooker. Many people expected charges to come. When you hear that someone has been held in custody for 5 days in connection with their spouse's disappearance, the assumption is usually that charges are imminent. But after 5 days, Bahamian authorities released Brian Hooker. They didn't have sufficient evidence to charge him, at least not at that moment. The investigation was ongoing, but they had to let him go. And once released, Brian did exactly what he said he wouldn't do. He left the Bahamas. The man who claimed he would never leave until he found Lynette departed almost immediately after being released from custody. His sole focus on searching for his wife apparently evaporated the moment he was free to leave. Brian's stated reason for leaving was that he needed to be with his mother in Michigan. He said his mother was sick and he needed to be there for her. Whether that was true or simply a convenient excuse, it meant Brian was no longer in the Bahamas. He was no longer anywhere near the location where his wife had disappeared. He was back in the United States, far from the water where Lynette had supposedly fallen from their dinghy. And Brian wasn't just physically distant from the search. He also wasn't with his sailboat, the soulmate. The boat remained in the Bahamas while Brian went to Michigan. He apparently arranged for someone else, possibly a hired captain, to bring the soulmate back to the United States. Brian wasn't on board when the boat made that journey. He had completely separated himself from the scene of his wife's disappearance, from the vessel they had lived on together, from any connection to the ongoing search for Lynette. Carly heard about her mother's disappearance and immediately knew something was wrong. She didn't need time to process the story or consider whether it might be true. She didn't give Brian the benefit of the doubt or wait for more information. From the very beginning, from the moment she heard that her mother had allegedly fallen from a dinghy in rough weather, Carly didn't believe it. And her disbelief wasn't based on a feeling or a daughter's inability to accept a tragic accident. It was based on something much more concrete. It was based on the threat Brian had made 2 years earlier, the threat where he told Lynette exactly how he would kill her. When investigators and media started looking into Lynette's disappearance, Carly was very quick to voice her suspicions about Brian. She didn't stay silent. She didn't protect her stepfather or give him the presumption of innocence that the legal system requires. She spoke up, and she spoke up loudly. Carly told anyone who would listen that Brian's story was suspicious, that it matched the threat he had made, that this was exactly what he said he would do to her mother. The coincidence, if you could even call it that, was impossible to ignore. Brian allegedly threatened to kill Lynette and throw her overboard so nobody could find her. And now Lynette was gone, having allegedly fallen overboard in a location where her body would be extremely difficult to find. Carly explained her reasoning clearly. She acknowledged that Brian had threatened this exact scenario 2 years ago. He said he would make sure this would happen to her. He threatened it, apparently multiple times according to Carly's understanding. And he had taken actions that hurt Lynette, physical violence that demonstrated he was capable of following through on threats. So now this is happening. Lynette is gone in circumstances that match the threat perfectly, and Carly is supposed to just believe Brian's story? She posed the question directly. You said that you were going to do this, and now it's happening. So why wouldn't I just believe your story? The logic was inescapable. If someone threatens to kill their spouse in a specific way, and then the spouse dies in that exact way, believing the death was accidental requires ignoring an incredibly significant piece of evidence. Carly wanted more answers than what Brian was providing. She needed more information, more details, more explanation than simply accepting that her mother fell off a dinghy and drowned. Given the history of violence and threats, given Brian's behavior after Lynette disappeared, given all the inconsistencies in the timeline, Carly had every reason to be suspicious. And she wasn't alone. Lynette's entire family shared her doubts. They all said Brian's story didn't add up. They all questioned what really happened that night. They all believed there was more to this than a tragic accident. During an interview, Carly revealed the details of what happened 2 years before her mother's disappearance. She explained that in 2024, when Brian and Lynette broke up temporarily, Carly went to visit her mother in Florida. During that visit, Lynette told her daughter what had happened. She told Carly that Brian had choked her. She told Carly that Brian had threatened to kill her and throw her overboard so that nobody could find her. This wasn't secondhand information or speculation. This was Lynette directly telling her daughter about the violence she had experienced and the specific threat Brian had made. Lynette immediately left after that fight, demonstrating that she took the threat seriously, that she recognized the danger she was in. But then, as happens in so many domestic violence situations, Lynette went back. A couple of months later, she returned to Brian. She returned to the relationship, returned to the sailboat, returned to the isolation and the fighting and the danger. And Carly believes the fighting continued. The problems persisted. Her mother was still in a dangerous relationship with a man who had already shown extreme violence and made explicit threats about how he would kill her. When asked what her mother was like, when asked about their last conversation, Carly described it as normal. She had been asking her mother for advice, and Lynette had helped her. Nothing unusual. Nothing that suggested Lynette knew she was in immediate danger. But then again, Lynette didn't confide in Carly about relationship problems. She kept those issues to herself. So even if Lynette was afraid, even if she sensed something bad was about to happen, she might not have told her daughter. The last image Carly has of her mother is from that Friday before she disappeared. A normal conversation. A mother helping her daughter. Advice about life. And then, days later, Lynette was gone. Carly has been left with grief and questions and a deep suspicion that her mother's disappearance was not an accident. She has been left wearing a memorial shirt with her mother's image, speaking to media, demanding answers, refusing to let this case fade away into an unsolved missing persons file. While Brian Hooker was back in the United States, while the soulmate was making its way from the Bahamas toward Florida, federal authorities were watching. The United States Coast Guard didn't just wait for the sailboat to arrive at a marina and then politely ask to take a look at it. They conducted what they officially described as a complex surveillance and interdiction operation. This was a coordinated federal law enforcement action involving multiple assets and agencies. The Coast Guard was tracking the soulmate as it crossed the ocean toward the Florida coast. They were monitoring its position, its course, its speed. They had aircraft in the sky and vessels on the water, all focused on this one sailboat making its way back to the United States. Approximately 40 nautical miles off the coast of Melbourne, Florida, the Coast Guard made their move. Special agents with the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, known by the acronym CAIS, moved in to seize the vessel. This was supported by surface assets from Coast Guard Sector Miami and aviation assets from Air Station Miami. They had helicopters. They had fixed-wing aircraft with sophisticated camera technology capable of tracking vessels from high altitude. They had Coast Guard cutters, the armed vessels that serve as the service's primary surface presence. All of this was coordinated to intercept and seize the soulmate at sea. The photographs released by the Coast Guard show the operation in detail. There are images of Coast Guard personnel approaching the soulmate from behind in the open Atlantic. There are photos showing the moment federal agents boarded the sailboat. There is aerial footage captured from aircraft showing the soulmate from above as it moved through the water, being tracked by federal authorities. These aren't casual snapshots. These are documentation of a major federal law enforcement operation. The level of resources dedicated to this seizure indicates how seriously the Coast Guard was taking this case. Something happened during or shortly after the seizure that required a change in plans. The soulmate lost engine power. Whether the engine failed mechanically, whether someone disabled it, or whether it was shut down as part of the seizure operation, the result was that the sailboat could no longer move under its own power. The Coast Guard had to take the vessel under tow. The Coast Guard cutter Winslow Greaser performed the initial towing operation, pulling the soulmate through open water. As they approached the Florida coast, the towing operation was transferred to a crew from Coast Guard Station Fort Pierce. This crew brought the sailboat through the Fort Pierce Inlet and to the Coast Guard Station, where it has remained ever since. At the Coast Guard Station in Fort Pierce, the soulmate became an official crime scene. Yellow crime scene tape was erected around the entire vessel. This is not standard procedure for an accidental drowning investigation. Crime scene tape means authorities believe a crime occurred on or involving that location. Investigators have been observed going on and off the boat multiple times. They've been photographed carrying items off the vessel, presumably evidence being removed for analysis. They've been taking photographs of the boat, documenting everything about its condition and contents. The processing of the soulmate as a crime scene has been thorough and ongoing. This isn't a quick look around to rule out foul play. This is a detailed forensic examination of a vessel believed to be connected to a criminal act. The official statement released by the Coast Guard is carefully worded, but the language is significant. The statement says that special agents with KAIs, supported by multiple Coast Guard surface and aviation assets, seized the sailing vessel Soulmate as part of an ongoing criminal investigation into the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. Not an investigation into a disappearance. Not an accidental drowning investigation. A criminal investigation. The Coast Guard is explicitly stating that they are investigating Lynette's disappearance as a crime. That designation matters. It tells you how authorities are approaching this case. They don't think Lynette fell off a dinghy in rough weather and drowned. They think something criminal happened to her. The statement continues by describing the operation as a complex surveillance and interdiction coordinated by KAIs and operational Coast Guard surface and aviation assets. The use of the word complex is notable. This wasn't a simple matter of waiting for a boat to arrive and taking a look at it. This required planning, coordination, multiple agencies, significant resources. The Coast Guard was treating this as a major operation because they were treating Lynette's disappearance as a major criminal investigation. The statement also notes that following the seizure, the vessel lost engine power and was taken under tow. It describes the transfer of the towing operation and the eventual arrival at Fort Pierce. Then the statement says something else important. The vessel Soulmate is currently in the custody of KAIs as part of an active criminal investigation. The boat isn't just being examined. It's in custody. It's being held as evidence. Brian Hooker cannot access his sailboat. He cannot remove anything from it. He cannot control what investigators do with it. The boat is now property of the federal investigation until that investigation is complete. The statement goes on to say that due to the ongoing nature of the investigation, no additional details are being released at this time. That phrase, ongoing nature of the investigation, appears multiple times in Coast Guard communications about this case. It's repeated for emphasis. This is active. This is continuing. Things are happening behind the scenes that the public isn't being told about. The Coast Guard doesn't release crime scene photographs to the media for just any case. The images they provided of the Soulmate seizure and processing are meant to inform the public that this is a serious federal investigation. The aerial surveillance photo, in particular, shows the kind of sophisticated tracking capability the Coast Guard employs. These aren't standard search and rescue aircraft. These are surveillance planes equipped with technology used for homeland security operations, for tracking vessels involved in drug trafficking, for monitoring threats to national security. And they used those resources to track the Soulmate as it returned from the Bahamas. That level of attention tells you everything about how the Coast Guard views this case. The aviation technology the Coast Guard uses is genuinely impressive. The fixed-wing aircraft can stay airborne for 8 to 10 hours, covering vast stretches of ocean, tracking multiple vessels simultaneously. The camera systems on board can identify and monitor targets from high altitude, capturing clear images even from miles away. The photo of the Soulmate from above, showing the boat as a small white shape on blue water, demonstrates that capability. The Coast Guard knew exactly where that sailboat was at all times during its journey back to Florida. They watched it. They tracked it. And when the moment was right, they moved in and seized it. Carly has been largely in the dark about the specifics of the investigation. She understands why. When you have an active criminal investigation, law enforcement doesn't share details with family members, no matter how much those family members deserve to know what's happening. Information has to be protected. Evidence has to be secured. The integrity of the investigation has to be maintained. So Carly waits. She waits for updates that may or may not come. She waits for answers about what happened to her mother. She waits for justice. The last time Carly heard from her Coast Guard contact was about a week before she gave a media interview. The investigator asked her some questions, which she answered, but she didn't receive information in return. The communication was one way. She provides what she knows, and then she waits to hear if it helped, if it led anywhere, if it brought investigators closer to understanding what happened that night in the Bahamas. Carly has said that most of what she knows about the investigation's progress comes from media coverage. She watches news programs like Ashley Banfield's show on Court TV, which has done extensive coverage of her mother's case. She learns what the public learns, when the public learns it. That's frustrating for a daughter who lost her mother under suspicious circumstances, but she understands it's necessary. What Carly didn't know was that the Coast Guard was planning to seize the soulmate when it entered United States waters. She hoped that would happen. She wanted the boat to be taken and examined as evidence. But she wasn't informed in advance that it was going to happen. So when news broke that federal agents had intercepted the sailboat 40 miles offshore and seized it as part of a criminal investigation, Carly learned about it the same way everyone else did. She was happy that they took the boat. She was glad that it was being processed as a crime scene. But she hadn't been given advance notice. The investigation was moving forward, but the family was being kept at a distance from the details. There are people working behind the scenes on this case who have indicated that more developments are coming. Sources close to the investigation have suggested that there is movement happening that the public isn't aware of yet. They've indicated that in the coming weeks, there should be more progress, more information, possibly more significant actions taken. What that means specifically is unclear. It could mean charges are being prepared. It could mean additional evidence has been found. It could mean investigators have developed new leads or new information that changes the direction of the case. Whatever it is, people with knowledge of the investigation believe something is coming. The Bahamian investigation is still ongoing as well. Just because authorities there released Brian Hooker after 5 days doesn't mean they closed the case. It means they didn't have enough evidence at that moment to charge him. But investigations continue. Evidence gets processed. New information comes to light. Witnesses remember details they didn't mention initially. Technology allows for analysis that wasn't possible immediately after an incident. The Bahamian authorities haven't forgotten about Lynette Hooker. They're still working the case from their end, coordinating with United States federal investigators, sharing information, building whatever case might exist. The United States Coast Guard Investigative Service is encouraging anyone with information about Lynette Hooker's disappearance to come forward. They've set up a tips line specifically for this case. If anyone saw anything that night in the Bahamas, if anyone heard Brian Hooker say something about what happened, if anyone has any piece of information, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, the Coast Guard wants to hear about it. Sometimes the detail that breaks a case wide open is something a witness didn't think was important. Someone might have seen the Hooker's dinghy that night. Someone might have noticed the weather conditions and thought Brian's description didn't match reality. Someone might have spoken with Brian before or after Lynette disappeared and heard him say something that now seems relevant. Any of those pieces of information could matter. Brian Hooker has not been charged with any crime. That's important to state clearly. No matter how suspicious the circumstances appear, no matter what threats he allegedly made in the past, no matter how many people don't believe his story, Brian Hooker is legally innocent until proven otherwise. He has the right to that presumption. Investigations take time. Evidence has to be gathered, analyzed, verified. Prosecutors have to build cases that can stand up in court. None of that happens quickly, especially in a case like this where the alleged victim's body hasn't been recovered, where the incident happened in international waters, where the evidence is complex and the jurisdiction involves multiple agencies and countries. But the fact that Brian hasn't been charged doesn't mean he won't be. The level of investigative resources being dedicated to this case suggests authorities believe there's something to investigate. The designation of this as a criminal investigation rather than an accidental death or missing persons case tells you how the Coast Guard views what happened. The seizure of the soulmate, the crime scene tape, the ongoing processing of evidence, all of it points toward an investigation that's building towards something. Whether that something is criminal charges remains to be seen. But clearly, federal investigators believe Lynette Hooker's disappearance was not a simple accident. Lynette's body has not been found. More than a month after she allegedly fell from that dinghy in the waters off the Bahamas, there has been no recovery. The ocean is vast and unforgiving. Currents move bodies significant distances. Marine life disturbs remains. The chances of finding someone who went into the water at night in the open ocean decrease dramatically with each passing day. If Lynette did fall from that dinghy and drown, If Brian's story is true, then her body may never be recovered. The ocean may have taken her permanently. But if Brian's story isn't true, if something else happened to Lynette before she ever went into the water, then the lack of a body becomes evidence of a different kind. It becomes evidence that someone made sure she wouldn't be found, just like Brian allegedly threatened to do 2 years before she disappeared. Lynette Hooker had a dream of sailing the world. She achieved that dream, living on a boat with her husband, exploring the Caribbean and the Bahamas. But that dream became a nightmare. The life she wanted, the adventure she sought, the freedom she hoped for, all of it ended on a dark night in April when she vanished into the ocean. Whether she fell accidentally, as her husband claims, or whether something far more sinister happened, is now the subject of a major federal criminal investigation. The United States Coast Guard has seized the sailboat Lynette called home. They've processed it as a crime scene. They've designated this case as a criminal investigation. They're dedicating significant resources to finding out what really happened. Lynette's daughter knows what she believes. She believes her stepfather's story doesn't add up. She believes the circumstances of her mother's disappearance match the threat Brian made 2 years earlier too closely to be coincidental. She believes her mother deserves justice, and she's not going to stop speaking out until she gets answers. The investigation is ongoing. Evidence is being processed. Federal agents are working to piece together what happened on that April night. And somewhere, possibly in Michigan, possibly elsewhere, Brian Hooker waits to see what investigators will find on the sailboat he shared with the wife, who is now missing. There is more to this story, more evidence to examine, more questions to answer. If you want to stay updated on this case, make sure you're subscribed to True Crime Desk. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and help us continue bringing you detailed coverage of cases like this. If this story affected you, if you want justice for Lynette, leave a comment below. Share this video. Keep Lynette's story alive. Thank you for watching True Crime Desk, and I'll see you in the next investigation.